In this lecture, we will review conformity and obedience. We will take a look at the following classic studies: Sherif's studies of norm formation, Asch's studies of group pressure, and Milgram's obedience studies. But first, what is conformity? A change in behavior or belief as a result of real or imagined group pressure. So, conformity is a change in behavior or belief as a result of real or imagined group pressure. So it doesn't have to be always real, but it can also be imagined group pressure. Acceptance occurs when you genuinely believe in what the group has persuaded you to do. You inwardly and sincerely believe that the group's actions are right. So it is conformity that involves both acting and believing in accord with social pressure. Now, compliance is conforming to an expectation or a request without really believing in what you are doing. It is conformity that involves publicly acting in accord with an implied or explicit request while privately disagreeing. So, obedience or complying with a direct command is a variation of compliance. It is a type of compliance involving acting in accord with a direct order or command. Now let's dive into the classic conformity and obedience studies. We will first take a look at Sherif's studies of norm formation. Sherif's experiment showed that group norms are established through interaction of individuals with a leveling off of extreme opinions. The result is a consensus agreement that tends to be a compromise, even if it's wrong. Sherif's experiment showed group norms are established through interaction of individuals and the leveling off of extreme opinions. And as we know, norms are implicit, unsaid rules shared by a group of individuals that guide their interactions with others and among society or social group. Sherif stated that one of the main problems for social psychology is how we can observe and measure the formation in effective social norms. In 1937, Sherif reported a classic experiment of norm formation. Sherif's experiment allows us to observe and to measure the formation of a group norm. Okay, let's move on to Asch's studies of group pressure. Shuttleworth went on to examine Asch's studies and claimed that the experiment is related closely to the Stanford Prison and Milgram experiments, in that it tries to show how perfectly normal human beings can be pressured into unusual behavior by authority figures or by the consensus of opinion around them. For the experiment, 8 subjects were seated around a table, with the seating plan carefully constructed to prevent any suspicion. Only one participant was actually a genuine subject for the experiment, the rest being Confederates, carefully tailored to give certain pre-selected responses. Careful experimental construction placed a varying amount of peer pressure on the individual test subject. The experiment was simple in its construction. Each participant, in turn, was asked to answer a series of questions, such as which line was longest or which matched the different line. The participants gave a variety of answers, at first correct, to avoid arousing suspicion in the subject, but then with some incorrect responses added. This would allow Asch to determine how the answers of the subject would change with the added influence of peer pressure. The Asch experiment results were interesting and showed that peer pressure could have a measurable influence on the answers given. The control group, those not exposed to peer pressure, where everybody gave correct answers, threw up only one incorrect response out of 35. This could probably be explained by experimental error. The results for the other groups were interesting. When surrounded by people given an incorrect answer, over 1/3 of the subjects also voiced an incorrect opinion. At least 75% of the subjects gave the wrong answer to at least one question, although experimental error may have had some influence in this figure. There was no doubt, however, that peer pressure can cause conformity. It was debated whether it is because people disbelieve the evidence of their own eyes, or if it was just compliance, that people hide their own opinions. Follow-ups to the Asch experiment showed that the number of dissenting voices made a difference to the results, as did the forcefulness of the Confederates. One incorrect Confederate made little difference to the answers, but the influence steadily increased with 2 or 3 people disagreed. The figures did not change much after this point. More Confederates made little difference. The number of people in the group also made a difference. The influence of dissenting voices leveled off for groups of more than 6 or 7 people. The experiments also showed that even if only one other participant disagreed with the Confederates, the subject was more likely to resist peer pressure. It appears to be more difficult to resist the majority if isolated. The Asch experiment showed that one voice can make a difference amongst many. There have been a number of criticisms of Asch experiments. The subjects were all young males, and they tend to be much more impressionable than older men. More mature people have had enough experience of life and more mental strength. They are more likely to hold true to their convictions. Another criticism that the experiment lacks ecological credibility and does not relate to real-life situations is one that can be leveled at many psychological experiments, including the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. Other follow-up experiments where the subjects were allowed to write down responses anonymously showed far fewer incorrect answers. The comfort of anonymity made sure that looking foolish became much less of a pressure. Now let's move on to the Milgram's obedience studies. Now, according to Hopper, in the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of studies on the concepts of obedience and authority. His experiments involved instructing study participants to deliver increasingly high voltage shocks to an actor in another room who would scream and eventually go silent as the shocks became stronger. The shocks weren't real, but study participants were made to believe that they were. Today, the Milgram experiment is widely criticized on both ethical and scientific grounds. However, Milgram's conclusions about humanity's willing to obey authority figures remain influential and well known. In the most well-known version of Stanley Milgram's experiment, the 40 male participants were told that the experiment focused on the relationship between punishment, learning, and memory. The experimenter then introduced each participant to the second individual, explaining that this second individual was participating in the study as well. Participants were told that they would be randomly assigned to roles of either teacher and learner. However, the second individual was an actor hired by the research team, and the study was set up so that the true participant would always be assigned to the teacher role. During the study, the learner was located in a separate room from the teacher, and don't forget the teacher is the real participant. But the teacher could hear the learner through the wall. The experimenter told the teacher that the learner would memorize word pairs and instructed the teacher to ask the learner questions. If the learner responded incorrectly to the question, the teacher would be asked to administer an electric shock. The shock started at a relatively mild level, which was about 15 volts, but increased in 15-volt increments up to 450 volts. In actuality, the shocks were fake, but the participant was led to believe that they were real. Participants were instructed to give a higher shock to the learner with the wrong answer. When the 150-volt shock was administered, the learner would cry out in pain and ask to leave the study. He would then continue crying out with each shock until the 330-volt level, at which point he would stop responding. During this process, whenever participants expressed hesitation about continuing with the study, the experimenter would urge them to go on with increasingly firm instructions. You have no other choice. You must go on. The study ended when participants refused to obey the experimenter's design, or when they gave the learner the highest level of shock on the machine, which was about 450 volts. Milgram found that participants obeyed the experimenter at an unexpectedly high rate. 65% of the participants gave the learner the 450-volt shock. Okay. I know it's hard to believe, so let's go on to the critics of the Milgram experiment. Milgram's experiment has been widely criticized on ethical grounds. Milgram's participants were led to believe that they acted in a way that harmed someone else, an experience that could have long-term consequences. So, an investigation by writer Gina Perry uncovered that some participants appear to not have been fully debriefed after the study. They were told months later, or not at all, that the shocks were fake and that the learner wasn't harmed. Milgram's studies could not be perfectly recreated today because researchers today are required to pay much more attention to the safety and well-being of human research subjects. Researchers have also questioned the scientific validity of Milgram's results. In her examination of the study, Perry found that Milgram's experimenter may have gone off script and told participants to obey many more times than the script specified. Additionally, some research suggests that participants may have figured out that the learner was not actually harmed. In interviews conducted after the study, some participants reported that they didn't think the learner was in any real danger. This mindset is likely to have affected their behavior in the study. So now, for quiz purposes, in summary of classic obedience studies, we will review the topic, researcher, method, and real-life example. The topic is norm formation. Who was the researcher? Yes, Sherif. What was the method used? Assessing suggestibility regarding semen movement of light. And real-life example. Interpreting events differently after hearing from others, appreciating a tasty food that others love. Next, the topic, conformity. The researcher, Asch. The method used, agreement with others, obviously wrong perceptual judgments. Real-life example, doing as others do, fads such as tattoos. Next, the topic, obedience. The researcher, Milgram. The method used, complying with commands to shock another. Real-life example, soldiers or employees following questionable orders. Now, in my next lecture, we will review the topic of persuasion. What paths lead to persuasion? What are the elements of persuasion? How can persuasion be resisted? Yes, indeed, the total topic of the art of persuasion. I'll see you soon.